At my 68th birthday party, my son asked a question that changed everything. My father-in-law built an empire houses cars, even a yacht, he said, his voice filled with pride. Then he looked at my 10-year-old suit, glanced at the $10 discount cake in front of me, his eyes full of pity. "And you, Dad? Besides a pile of pension checks, what have you actually built?" The entire room fell silent. I just smiled. Looked straight at the son I've secretly supported for so many years. You really want to know? Glad you're here with me. Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from today. It means a lot. Just a quick note, parts of this story have been creatively shaped to make it more engaging and meaningful for everyone listening. The silence in my charcoal 2009 sedan was a familiar friend, but the opulence waiting behind the wrought iron gates of the Heights felt like a personal insult. I pulled up to the security kiosk, the gravel crunching under my tires with a sound that seemed too loud for such a manicured neighborhood. A young security guard stepped out his uniform, pressed so sharply it looked like it might snap. He looked at my car, then at his clipboard, then back at my car. His eyes traced the slight dent in my rear fender and the layer of road salt from a trip I'd taken to inspect a pylon in the upstate foothills last week. I rolled down my window, letting in the biting December air. "Visitor for the Garrison residence?" He asked, his voice dripping with the kind of practiced politeness that really meant he was wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn. "Sir, you'll need to park in the rear overflow area by the service entrance." I didn't flinch. I kept my hands on the steering wheel right at 10 and 2, exactly as I'd taught my son 20 years ago. "I'm the guest of honor," I told him, my voice flat and steady. "It's my 68th birthday." He blinked, checked his list again, and finally hit the button to swing the heavy iron gates open. I didn't thank him. I just drove through, ignoring his directions to the rear, and pulling my charcoal sedan right onto the pristine driveway, feeling the eyes of the neighborhood on my faded paint job. I intentionally drove my oldest, dirtiest car to this high society event as a stress test for my son's character. I wanted to see if the boy I raised still recognized the value of the engine, or if he had become obsessed with the shine of the hood. As I shut off the engine in the center of the driveway, flanked by silver and black German SUVs that cost more than my first two houses combined, I took a deep breath. Thane Garrison, a 68-year-old retired senior bridge inspector, stepped out of his charcoal 2009 sedan, my eyes tracing the hairline fractures in the driveway's concrete with professional habit. It was a beautiful house, 3 stories of glass and stone, but to me, it looked fragile. Have you ever seen a bridge that looked beautiful but had rusted bolts hidden in its heart? That was this house. It was a performance in architecture, a statement of success that required a constant, exhausting effort to maintain. I climbed the steps, and the front door opened before I could even reach for the polished brass handle. Vanessa Vance Garrison, 31, an interior design consultant who viewed every room as a potential portfolio piece, adjusted the centerpiece on a nearby console with surgical precision. She looked at me, her smile tight and controlled, the kind of smile you give a distant relative you're forced to tolerate at a funeral. "Thane, you made it," she said, her voice an octave too high. "Let's get that coat. It's a bit damp, isn't it?" She took my scratchy wool jacket as if it were a biohazard, handing it immediately to a waiting server. I walked further into the foyer, my sensible shoes clicking hollowly on the imported marble. The air smelled of expensive pine-scented candles and the metallic tang of dry champagne. Julian Garrison, 34. A cybersecurity sales manager dressed in a tailored wool blazer that cost more than my monthly pension, paced the marble foyer with restless energy. He saw me and stopped, his eyes darting to the window to see where I'd parked. "Dad," he whispered, pulling me slightly toward the library. "Try to keep the bridge inspector stories to a minimum tonight. Okay, Garrett's partners are here. They're looking for vision, not maintenance logs." I looked at my son, noticing the way his tie was knotted just a bit too tight, a silent scream of insecurity. My son looked at me, not with love, with a calculation of my net worth. We moved into the dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a mahogany table that could have seated 20. Garrett Vance, a 62-year-old boutique resort developer with a deep tan and a smile as bright and artificial as a showroom floor, commanded the dinner table from his usual seat at the head. He was holding court, gesturing with a glass of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The guests were a blur of silk and gold people who spoke in acronyms and growth margins. I sat at the far end of the table, feeling the distance between myself and my son, like a physical chasm. The air in the room didn't just feel expensive, it felt thin, like we were all standing on a mountain peak that was starting to crumble. Julian stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass to signal for silence. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he began, his voice projected with sales team confidence. "This year has been about growth. Garrett just closed the deal on a 100-foot yacht. It's about building a legacy, about having the courage to reach for the horizon." Garrett nodded, accepting the praise as if it were his birthright. Then Julian turned his gaze toward me. The light from the crystal chandelier overhead seemed to intensify, focusing on my 10-year-old suit and my quiet face. "But Dad," Julian said, his voice dropping into a tone of theatrical pity that made my skin crawl. "What have you actually built? I mean, look at this table. Look at Garrett's empire. You spent 40 years checking bolts on other people's bridges. All you have to show for it is a pile of pension checks and, well, this." He signaled to a server who entered the room, carrying a small, flimsy white box. With a smug grin, Julian took the box and placed it in the center of the $1,000 mahogany table. It was a cheap plastic-wrapped $10 cake from the discount grocer down the street, complete with a neon yellow manager's special sticker, still clinging to the plastic dome. "We thought we'd get you something in your tax bracket, Dad." Julian laughed and the table erupted in polite, cruel titters. I felt the floorboards of his ego finally shear under the weight of the mockery. I looked at the plastic-wrapped cake, then at Julian's smug face, and realized the inspection was over. The structure had failed completely. A bridge doesn't collapse all at once. It groans under the weight of 1,000 small betrayals before the steel finally snaps. I looked at the plastic-wrapped cake, then at Julian's smug face, and realized the inspection was over. The structure had failed completely. The neon yellow sticker on the plastic dome felt like a high-visibility warning sign I should have seen coming years ago. Julian was still grinning, looking around the table for the approval of guests who were busy stifling giggles behind silk napkins. I didn't say a word. I simply sat there maintaining my stoic mask, while the laughter from my own son's insults still echoed through the cavernous dining room. My professional training as an inspector had taught me that when a pylon is under maximum stress, you don't agitate it. You wait. You observe. You look for the source of the rot. My mind retreated 30 minutes earlier, back to when the dinner was still a carefully curated performance of success. Garrett Vance was holding court, his deep tan glowing under the crystal chandelier like polished teak. He was mid-sentence describing the Vance legacy, a custom 100-foot yacht he claimed was currently being outfitted in a shipyard in Italy. "It's not just a boat," Julian Garrett had said, leaning forward and capturing the room's attention with a charismatic flare of his nostrils. "It's a statement that the Vance name will be carved into the coastline for a century. We're talking about 3 decks of bespoke luxury carbon-reinforced polymer and a master suite that overlooks the wake." Julian had hung on every word, his eyes wide, with the kind of worship I hadn't seen him give since he was 5 years old, looking at a fire truck. "I wish my dad had half that much ambition," Garrett Julian had replied, casting a dismissive glance toward me. "He spent his life checking other people's work instead of creating his own world." Garrett's laugh sounded like expensive crystal, breaking pretty to some, but sharp enough to draw blood. I watched Garrett closely, my inspector's eye cataloging the way he gripped his wine glass. I knew Garrett worked for the firm that got blacklisted by the State Bridge Authority 10 years ago for using substandard bolts, a fact Julian has clearly forgotten or was never told. As the second course was cleared, Garrett began passing around high-gloss architectural renderings of the supposed yacht. Julian treated them like holy relics, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced the sleek lines of the hull. He passed them to the neighbor on his right with a reverence that made my stomach turn. I accepted one of the sheets when it eventually reached the end of the table. My decades of structural experience immediately flared. Garrett was describing a carbon-reinforced polymer hull, but the shipyard he mentioned in Livorno was strictly a steel and aluminum facility. They didn't even have the autoclaves required for that kind of polymer work. I looked at the rendering. It was beautiful, certainly, but technically impossible for the yard in question. I began to realize Garrett isn't just bragging. He's selling a fantasy. "Precision Thane," Garrett said, catching me squinting at the fine print on the rendering. "Something a bridge inspector might appreciate if you'd ever worked on anything moving. Why is it that the loudest men always seem to have the quietest bank accounts when the bill finally comes due?" I looked at Julian, who was busy mimicking Garrett's posture, leaning back with one arm draped over the mahogany chair, trying to project an aura of unearned command. He looked so much like Garrett in that moment, a shadow reflecting a ghost. Garrett mentioned leverage as the ultimate tool of the wise, explaining how only fools use their own capital when the world is full of other people's money. Julian nodded with a dangerous, unearned confidence. Debt is just fuel for the engine, Dad. Julian said, looking at me with a pity that stung more than his earlier insults. You've spent your life idling in the driveway, afraid to put your foot on the gas, because you're worried about the price of the fuel. I took a slow sip of my water, the coldness of it a sharp contrast to the heat of the indignation rising in my chest. Fuel can explode, Julian, I said quietly, especially when the tank is full of holes. Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes that time. He looked at me with a sudden sharp calculation as if he were trying to see if I knew about the cracks I was implying. Believe me, when you spend 30 years looking for cracks in steel, you start to see them in people's smiles too. I watched the way the light hit the sideboard, illuminating Garrett's designer coat that he'd draped there earlier. As Garrett leaned over to whisper something to Vanessa, I noticed a subtle tremor in his hand as he gripped his wine glass. It was the shake of a man whose adrenaline was no longer a choice, but a reflex of fear. Then I saw it, a corner of a white envelope peeking out of his coat pocket. It was bright stark and marked with a red stamp that I recognized from a distance urgent notice. It was the kind of envelope that usually contains a final demand, or a notice of default. My son was worshiping a man who was carrying his own house of cards in his pocket. Julian was oblivious, laughing at a joke Garrett made about government pensions. He was so desperate to be part of the Vance legacy that he couldn't see the man in front of him was already sinking. I looked at that envelope on the sideboard, then back at the man promising my son a legacy, and I knew exactly which bolt was about to shear off first. The dinner theater was reaching its final act, and I was the only one who had read the real script. I adjusted the cuffs of my 10-year-old charcoal suit, feeling the scratchy wool against my wrists, a stark reminder that I was a rough-cut stone in a room full of polished glass. The urgent notice red stamp practically glowed under the recessed lighting of the foyer, a harbinger of the structural failure Garrett Vance was trying to outrun. I moved slowly through the crowd of Garrett's associates and local socialites, my hands clasped behind my back in the habit of a man who spent 40 years walking steel girders. I realized that despite being the father of the host, I was being treated as little more than a service worker or an invisible ghost. Conversations lulled just enough for me to pass, then snap back into place like elastic sealing me out. I observed the performative nature of the guests. They checked their reflections in every gilded surface, adjusting silk ties and diamond studs. While completely ignoring the man who had actually built the quiet, unshakable life they were busy pretending to have achieved. One man holding a flute of champagne that probably cost more than my first car's engine looked right through me. "Pardon me," he said, with a bored drawl. "Do you know where the server took the appetizers?" I turned slightly, meeting his gaze with the steady, unnerving focus of an inspector. "I'm Julian's father," I replied. He blinked, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before he muttered an apology and vanished back into the sea of silk. I found a spot near a high-top table, my back to a wall, and began my own mental structural audit of the foyer. A diamond necklace on a neck full of lies is still just a rock. I noted the expensive but ill-fitting suits on the younger men. The sleeves were a fraction too long, the shoulders too padded, symbolizing their borrowed status, and the frantic pace at which they were trying to outgrow their foundations. They were all silhouettes of Garrett chasing a ghost of success that didn't have a solid pylon to its name. Julian approached me briefly, his face tight. He wasn't there to check on me or to see if I needed a drink. He was there to manage the aesthetics. "Dad, maybe just stay over by the bookshelf. The lighting is better there, and you're sort of blocking the flow to the great room." I looked at him, seeing the panic behind his eyes. "I didn't realize my presence had a lighting requirement, Julian," I said softly. He didn't even hear the edge in my voice. He was already looking past me, waving at a local councilman. I watched a young woman, Julian's personal assistant, discreetly checking the undersides of the massive floral arrangements. My eyes caught the glint of a tag she tried to tuck away. They hadn't been paid for. They were on a 48-hour rental, just like the image Julian was trying to project to his guests. When did my son start seeing people as rungs on a ladder instead of human beings? The realization made the scratchy wool of my suit feel even more abrasive. Eventually, the signal was given for the transition to the dining room. Julian treated the movement of the crowd like a strategic troop deployment, ushering the high-value targets men who could offer him leverage or a bigger commission to the seats closest to Garrett. I waited until the shuffle settled, finding my place at the very far end of the mahogany table. I was as far from Julian and his father-in-law as the room would allow. It was a cold, deliberate marginalization, a way to keep the government inspector from cluttering the conversation about multi-million-dollar yacht deals and leveraged debt. The dining room felt like a courtroom, where the verdict had been decided before the first witness was called. I looked down at my place setting, and for a moment I saw the ghost of Julian as a toddler sitting on my lap, while I explained the blueprint of a simple truss. That boy was gone, replaced by this man who viewed his father as a footnote in a carefully edited autobiography. I reached for my water glass, but as I moved my hand, I felt something beneath the edge of the heavy bone china plate. It was a small piece of paper. I slid it out carefully, shielding it with my hand. It was a handwritten note from Vanessa's mother, Pamela. It simply said, "I know. Help him." I looked up, searching for her across the expanse of the table, but she was busy listening to her husband spin another yarn about his Miami holdings. I pocketed the note, the paper feeling like a hot coal against my palm. I knew Pamela had seen the same cracks I had. She lived with the architect of this fraud. She knew the Vance legacy was a hollow shell. Julian leaned over to me, then his voice a final dismissive whisper before the main course service began. "It's just for the flow of conversation, Dad. You'll be comfortable there," he said, gesturing to the empty space around me. "Comfortable is a word for shoes, Julian," I replied, my voice sounding like the first groan of a bridge under stress. "Not family." He didn't flinch. He didn't even look ashamed. He just patted my shoulder with a condescending rhythm and stood up to offer the toast. The room went silent, the air heavy with the artificial scent of floor wax and lilies. The sound of silverware clinking like miniature swords died away, leaving only the expectant gaze of 20 people who were about to witness a performance. I felt the note from Pamela in my pocket, a silent alliance from the heart of the enemy camp. Julian raised his glass, the crystal catching the light of the chandelier and throwing sharp, jagged shadows across the table. I sat at the end of that long mahogany distance, the invisible pylon holding up a bridge he was determined to burn. I pocketed the note, the paper feeling like a hot coal against my palm, as Julian stood up to offer the toast that would shatter whatever was left of our family bridge. He began to speak, his voice full of the unearned authority of a man standing on someone else's mountain, and I prepared myself for the foundations of sand to finally give way. Wealth isn't the number on a digital screen. It's the weight of the secrets you keep to ensure your son never has to see the bottom of an empty cupboard. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, the cold condensation on my crystal water glass seeping into my palm. Julian stood at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by the blinding white light of the chandelier, offering a toast that felt more like an indictment of my life's work. As he spoke, his voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of a man who sold security he didn't possess. My mind began to drift. The opulence of the Heights estate faded, replaced by the sterile gray reality of a hospital room 15 years ago. I was sitting in a plastic hospital chair that groaned with every shift of my weight. The air was a thick soup of antiseptic and stale coffee, and the only music was the rhythmic wheeze of a ventilator. Ellen Garrison, the ghost in my heart, appeared in my memory, as she was at the end, pale, sharp-featured, but with a gaze that could still find the structural flaws in any man's argument. She reached out her hand, a bundle of dry parchment, and gripped my wrist. "Don't let him grow up chasing ghosts." "Thane," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Give him a rock to stand on. He doesn't have your patience. He'll go looking for shortcuts if the road gets too steep." I looked at her, the woman who had balanced our checkbooks and mended our lives with a needle and thread. And I made the only choice an inspector knows how to make. "I'll build him a fortress, Ellen. I promise." I didn't tell her that the first stones of that fortress were already being laid. I had received a small life insurance payout when my own father passed away, a modest sum that most men would have used to pay off a mortgage or buy a new truck. Instead, I had quietly moved it into a secret trust. A promise to a dying woman is a bridge with no end. You just keep walking until your own legs give out. Memory is a fickle pylon. It shifts under the pressure of the present. Suddenly, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I was 30 years younger, sitting at the scarred oak kitchen table of our first small home in Rock Hill. The house was tiny, the insulation was thin, and the ticking wall clock sounded like a hammer against a nail in the quiet evening. Young Julian, age 8, sat with sticky fingers and a restless spirit, his eyes darting toward the television, while I tried to explain the foundations of the world. A vibrant race car commercial played on the old cathode ray TV, full of bright primary colors and the promise of speed. "Julian, look at this," I said, sliding a rough paper slip across the table. It was my very first dividend check from a local utility company, a mere $5. This $5 worked for me, Julian. I didn't have to lift a hammer for it. I didn't have to climb a pylon in a rainstorm. It's a seed. Julian glanced at the paper, then back at the screen, where a red plastic car was jumping through a hoop of fire. It's just $5, Dad? He'd grumbled, his lip curling with the impatience that would eventually become his trademark. That won't even buy the race car set. Why do we spend so much time teaching our children how to spend money, and so little time teaching them how to respect the time it took to earn it? That $5 became the blueprint for my entire existence. While Julian grew up, I became a master of the architecture of denial. I drove the same charcoal sedan until the floorboards rusted. I packed my own lunches in a metal box, eating sandwiches on bridge decks, while the wind whipped around my ears. I watched my peers buy boats and vacation homes, on credit their lives built on the shaky scaffolding of high-interest vanity. All the while, my portfolio grew in the shadows, a silent leviathan beneath the surface of my modest life. I realized as I sat at Julian's table that by hiding the struggle, I had accidentally robbed him of the wisdom that comes with it. I had given him the rock Ellen asked for, but I had buried it so deep he thought he was standing on air. Julian's voice rose, pulling me back to the present. He was gesturing toward Garrett Vance with an expansive, practiced grace. To Garrett. The man who knows that playing it safe is just another word for failing. To the man who taught me that vision requires leverage and leverage requires guts. The table erupted in a chorus of "hear, hear," and the rhythmic clink of silver against porcelain. I remained silent, a ghost of the man who had paid for it all. Julian looked down the table at me, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous, unearned confidence. He was confusing Garrett's borrowed light for a sun of his own making. Safe is only a dirty word until the ground starts to shake, Julian, I thought, but the words stayed behind my teeth. The crystal clinked. The lies flowed. I watched Garrett Vance lean back in his chair, his deep tan looking like a mask in the harsh light of the dining room. He reached into his blazer pocket, his fingers brushing against that white, urgent envelope again. He pulled it out just an inch, perhaps, checking if it was still there, or perhaps looking for a way to dispose of it. In that split second, the light hit the paper just right. I saw the logo embossed in the corner, a stylized blue eagle. My heart, usually as steady as a concrete pier, gave a sharp, uncomfortable thud. It was the logo for Piedmont Wealth Management. It was the exact same bank where I held my primary investment accounts, the place where my 35 years of discipline were stored. I looked at the bank logo on Garrett's envelope and realized my world and his were about to collide in a way Julian's fragile ego couldn't possibly survive. The man my son worshipped wasn't just a fraud. He was likely standing on a precipice that shared the same bedrock as my own life. Julian didn't knock 3 years ago. He pounded on my door with the frantic rhythm of a man whose house of cards was finally catching the wind. The sound echoed through my small Rock Hill bungalow, a sharp contrast to the steady rhythmic rain hitting the roof. I looked away from the dinner table. In the present, the sight of the Piedmont Wealth Management logo on Garrett's envelope acting as a catalyst that pulled me back to that stormy Tuesday night. I opened the door to find my son drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, and the smell of wet wool and rain radiating from his jacket. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past me into the kitchen, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the linoleum I'd just waxed. "Dad? I'm in trouble?" he gasped, his voice thin and brittle. I sat at the kitchen table watching him pace the small space like a caged animal. I could see the tremor in his hands, the same twitch I saw tonight at the Heights. He confessed that he was $82,000 short on the down payment for the estate. Vanessa's family was starting to ask questions about the delay, and Julian was spiraling. "Dad, if I don't close on this house, I lose Vanessa," he cried, turning to face me with eyes full of a wild, desperate hunger. "Her father, Garrett, he'll see right through me. He thinks I'm a visionary. If I fail now, I'm dead to them." I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and realized I was being asked to buy him a seat at a table where he didn't belong. I didn't tell him that $82,000 was the exact amount I had earmarked for my own health insurance supplement. I had a surgery scheduled for the following month, a necessary procedure to repair a lingering injury from my years on the bridge decks. I would have to postpone it, living with the pain for another year, just to save his reputation. Desperation is a corrosive acid. It eats away at the truth until there's nothing left but a hollow shell. I watched him spiral, his heavy, uneven breathing, the only sound in the room besides the rain. I stood up slowly and walked toward my small study. Julian followed me, his footsteps heavy and desperate. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The rhythmic blue glow of the screen illuminated the dark room, casting long, sharp shadows against the walls. Julian stood behind me, his breath hot against the back of my neck. I accessed my secret dividend growth account, a screen Julian had never even imagined existed. He stared at the numbers, the silent accumulation of 30 years of discipline, but he didn't see the work. He only saw the solution to his immediate panic. I began the process of the wire transfer, my fingers moving with a deliberate slowness. The metallic click of the keyboard keys felt like the steady beat of a heart that was being forced to compromise its own rhythm. I looked at the cold, bitter tea I'd left on the desk, a reminder of the quiet life I'd built that was now being raided to fund a fantasy. "I'm wiring it now," I said, my voice sounding older than I felt. "But you'll sign this private mortgage agreement first, just a formality for the trust," I told him. He barely glanced at the paper before signing, desperate for the funds. "It's an early inheritance, Julian. Consider it the final bolt in your foundation. Make it count." Julian let out a sob of relief that sounded more like a wounded animal than a grateful son. "I'll pay you back, Dad," he promised, his voice cracking. "Every cent. I promise." I didn't answer him. I knew the weight of that promise was too heavy for a man who didn't understand the value of the stone it was built on. Is it still a gift if the recipient has to lie to own it, I wondered, but I kept the thought buried deep beneath my stoic mask. I turned in my chair to face him, the blue light of the laptop making his face look like a pale mask. "You have to promise me one thing, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. "Never tell them this came from me. Not Vanessa, and certainly not Garrett Vance. Let them think you're the success they want you to be. If they know I funded this, Garrett will use it as leverage. He'll own you." Julian agreed quickly, the relief overriding any sense of guilt or curiosity. "I can do that," he said, reaching out to grab my hand. "Thank you, Dad. You have no idea what this means. You saved everything." He didn't realize that by saving his image, I was helping him build a prison. He was so eager to get back to the world of glass and steel that he didn't notice the ticking time bomb I was handed in return. The digital sent button felt like a trigger, and I was the one pointing the gun at my own peace of mind. I was funding a lie, and in doing so, I was becoming the silent architect of his eventual collapse. I looked back at the screen as the final confirmation appeared. The blue glow flickered, and for a second, my eyes narrowed as I read the details of the destination account. My heart, usually as steady as a concrete pier, gave a sharp, uncomfortable thud. The transfer confirmation screen showed that the destination account wasn't just Julian's. It was a joint account. My son hadn't even mentioned that Garrett Vance was listed as the primary signatory on the fund Julian used for the house. The $82,000 I'd just sent wasn't just going to Julian. It was landing directly in a pool controlled by the man who treated me like an invisible ghost. Julian was so caught up in his debt-free bliss that he didn't even see the look on my face. He was already checking his phone, probably texting Vanessa that the financing had come through. I sat in the calculated silence of my study, the metallic taste of cold tea on my tongue, and realized the magnitude of my mistake. I watched the confirmation spin on the screen, seeing Garrett's name next to my son's, and I realized I hadn't just given Julian a house. I had handed Garrett Vance the keys to my own safe. Back at the dinner table, the sharp ping of crystal brought me to my senses. I blinked, the blue ghost of my old laptop screen, fading from my retinas, replaced by the blinding white light of the dining room chandelier. Vanessa was standing now, her glass raised. I looked at the liquid inside a sickly sweet Chardonnay that left a film on the tongue, and then I looked at the room itself. I performed a mental structural audit, the kind I'd done for 40 years on the bridges spanning the Catawba. The gold leaf trim was flawless, the crown molding was precise, but beneath the performance I saw the stress fractures. There was a slightly frayed edge on the hand-woven rug beneath my feet, likely from a vacuum pushed too hard by a hurried cleaning crew. I noticed the way the waitstaff handled the porcelain plates they moved with a jittery caution, a telltale sign that they were serving owners who couldn't afford a single breakage. "Everything looks perfect, Julian," I said, my voice low and steady, almost too perfect. Julian didn't look at me. He was too busy adjusting his cufflink, his jaw tight enough to snap bone. "Images, everything in this neighborhood." "Dad," he replied without a trace of the warmth he used to have. "You wouldn't understand the upkeep. It's about maintaining the standard." Watching Julian nod along to a lie is like watching a master mason use mud instead of mortar. You know the collapse is coming, you just don't know who it will bury. Vanessa cleared her throat, her gaze fixed on her father at the head of the table. "To my father, Garrett, she began, her voice ringing with a devotion that felt practiced. Without his guidance and the doors he opened, we wouldn't be standing in this beautiful home tonight. He is the only man I know who really understands how to build a kingdom from the ground up. She smiled at Garrett, and I felt a cold marginalization settle in my chest. My $82,000, the money that had actually cleared the path for this kingdom, wasn't just forgotten, it was erased. It was a structural ghost, a support beam that had been painted over to look like part of the Vance legacy. Garrett didn't just provide the vision, he negotiated the terms of the mortgage personally. Vanessa continued, her eyes gleaming with pride. He made sure every detail was handled, so Julian and I could focus on our future. I felt the smooth, cold texture of my silver fork and tightened my grip. Garrett hadn't just negotiated, he had ensured he had a direct financial stake in Julian's debt. My son wasn't a king, he was a tenant in a castle Garrett truly owned. How many times can you erase a father from the blueprints before the whole structure loses its balance? I watched Julian nod in fervent agreement, his hand trembling slightly as he held his wine glass. He was so desperate to belong to the Vance bloodline that he was willing to ignore the man who had actually bled for his foundation. Garrett accepted the praise with a rehearsed modesty that made my skin crawl. He bowed his head slightly, the light catching the deep artificial tan of his forehead. A legacy is only as strong as the truth it's built on. Wouldn't you say, Garrett? I asked the question, cutting through the syrupy atmosphere of the toast. Garrett looked at me, then his eyes narrowing to cold slits. Ambition has its own truth, Thane. He replied, his voice a sharp contrast to the earlier warmth, something a man who spends his life inspecting other people's work might never quite grasp. The table went quiet, the silence heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Outside, the rain began to beat against the high windows with a sudden violent intensity, the sound like gravel being thrown against glass. The doorbell didn't ring. It tolled. The sound was heavy, a deep resonance that vibrated through the floorboards and seemed to rattle the very crystal on the table. It was a sound that shouldn't cause such a visible flinch in a house full of success. Yet I watched Garrett and Vanessa share a look of sudden, sharp anxiety. The performance of security fractured in an instant. Garrett's hand went to his blazer pocket, his fingers brushing the urgent notice I'd seen earlier. Vanessa's smile stayed in place, but it was a brittle thing now, a facade held up by sheer will. A servant moved to answer the door, and for a brief second the heavy oak foyer became visible through the dining room archway. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the window. Through the rain-streaked glass of the foyer, I saw the unmistakable glint of a metal badge, a legal server's badge, cold and official. Garrett's face turned a sickly shade of gray, a color that no amount of Florida sun could hide. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a celebration to a fragile performance of survival. I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cool weight of the glass. The truth has a way of finding the weakest point in a structure, no matter how much gold you use to hide it. Garrett's wine glass froze halfway to his lips as the heavy oak front door opened, and I realized the unshakable legacy was about to receive its first subpoena. The sound of the foyer's heavy latch clicking open echoed into the dining room like the first crack of a failing pylon. Julian looked confused, his head darting between his father-in-law and the archway, still trying to play the part of the successful homeowner. But the air in the room had changed. It felt thin and electric. I watched Garrett's jaw set, his eyes darting toward the side exit, looking for a way out that didn't exist. He had spent his life building a kingdom of shadows, and the sun was finally starting to rise. I didn't feel joy in that moment, only a grim professional satisfaction. I had spent my life looking for the rot, and I had finally found the heart of it. The next course was coming, but I knew that none of us would have the appetite to finish it. Garrett's hand didn't just shake, it twitched, the fine silver of his fork clattering against the bone china, with a sound like a distant alarm bell. I watched him closely, my internal sensors calibrated from 40 years of measuring the structural integrity of steel under pressure. The legal server I had seen through the window was no longer a ghost. He was a reality that had just breached the perimeter of Garrett's curated kingdom. The dining room, with its vaulted ceilings and excessive gold leaf, suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to witness the first major fracture. The butler, a man named Henderson, whose stiff posture suggested he was holding the entire house together by sheer will, moved with a silent efficiency that felt like a rebuke to the noisy wealth at the table. He leaned in, whispering something into Garrett's ear that made the man's deep artificial tan turn a sickly shade of gray. Garrett waved him off with a forced booming laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Just the upholstery crew, Julian, Garrett announced to the table. though his voice lacked its usual resonance. High-demand artisans wait for no one, not even a birthday dinner. Must be some expensive fabric to require a signature at this hour. Garrett, I said quietly. I saw the sweat beading on his upper lip glistening under the crystal chandelier. He didn't answer me. He couldn't. I knew what he was hiding, because I had requested a professional audit on him last week. His personal credit score was currently lower than the temperature outside, a detail that made his posturing look like a bridge held together by scotch tape. To regain his dominance, Garrett straightened his silk tie and launched into a condescending lecture directed at me. The problem with you, Thane, is that you've spent 40 years worrying about hairline fractures while the rest of us were building the skyline. You're an inspector by trade and it's bled into your soul. You look for reasons why things will fail instead of reasons why they should soar. He gestured with a wine glass that cost more than my first car. It's a small pension mindset. It's safe, sure, but it's essentially invisible. Men like you provide the safety net for visionaries like myself, but you never truly live because you are too afraid of a little debt. Why is it that the men who shout the loudest about their vision are usually the ones who can't see the foreclosure sign in their own front yard? I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. In my line of work, you learn that the loudest groans from a bridge usually happen right before the main support shears. Garrett was groaning now, using arrogance as a buttress against the legal reality waiting in the foyer. He talked about leverage as if it were a holy sacrament, oblivious to the fact that his own leverage was about to crush him. Julian joined the mockery, desperate to prove he belonged in Garrett's world. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a vintage red that he clearly didn't know how to appreciate. My dad thinks a savings account is a personality trait, Julian said, prompting a ripple of chuckles from the socialite guests. He's been counting pennies since the Carter administration. I remember when I was 12, and I asked for the premium cable package so I could watch the racing channels. He gave me a lecture on utility and opportunity cost. It was like living with a human calculator. My son laughed. It was a hollow sound, like wind whistling through a bridge that's about to give way. Wealth is a river, Dad. You're just trying to keep your feet dry in a puddle. The irony was a physical weight in the room. Julian was lecturing me on the flow of capital, while standing on a foundation I had secretly shored up with $82,000 of my own blood and sweat. But Garrett wasn't done. He leaned in, his eyes bright with a predatory glint. It's a good thing Julian doesn't share that fear, Thane. When we were finalizing the business loan for the Northridge project, he didn't hesitate. He knew he needed skin in the game. That's why he put your Rock Hill bungalow down as secondary collateral. He knew you'd understand it was for the family legacy. The rough texture of the linen napkin beneath my fingers felt suddenly abrasive. Julian hadn't just borrowed the down payment, he had mortgaged my home behind my back. The arrogance in the room was getting thick enough to choke on a poisonous fog of borrowed prestige and leased luxury. I looked at Julian, but he refused to meet my eyes. He was busy laughing at another one of Garrett's anecdotes, his shallow, nervous laughter cutting through me like a serrated blade. He was no longer just a victim of Garrett's influence, he was an active architect of my humiliation. He had taken the one piece of earth I truly owned and handed it over to a man whose empire was built on sand. I could smell the expensive wood-heavy cologne Garrett wore, a scent designed to mask the smell of rot. I felt a cold, focused anger beginning to crystallize in my chest, a structural hardening that Julian had never seen. I realized then that my son didn't see me as a father or a provider. He saw me as a resource to be mined, a safety factor to be exhausted. Garrett was still talking about the Vance name and the heights they would reach. While I sat there visualizing the exact moment the bungalow's deed would change hands if Garrett's house of cards fell, I set my napkin down beside the half-eaten steak, the weight of the collateral Julian had stolen from me, pressing against my chest like a physical blow, and I knew the next course wouldn't be food. There's one more thing, I added. I reached for the edge of the table steady. That lion I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just a safeguard. I glanced at Vanessa, then back at Julian. It gives me controlling interest over this property under financial distress conditions. Julian's face went blank. Meaning, I said, if your financial position collapses because of what you signed, this house doesn't go to the bank. I let the silence stretch. It comes to me. I sat in that high-backed mahogany chair, my spine a rigid line of reinforced concrete, watching the main course arrive with a precision that felt like a burial rite. The smell of buttery Wagyu beef began to fill the room, thick and heavy, mixing with the metallic tang of the tension that had gripped the table since the server arrived at the door. Julian was oblivious, Or perhaps he was simply performing so hard, he'd convinced himself the stage wasn't burning. He leaned forward, his face flushed with a mixture of expensive wine and the desperate thrill of Garrett's approval. He reached for a decanter, carefully pouring a deep crimson liquid into Garrett's glass. I watched the label, or rather the lack of one. My eyes caught the slight mismatch between the cork on the sideboard and the bottle Julian had hidden in the shadows of the ice bucket. He was pouring a $20 vintage into a $100 decanter, faking the details to keep his father-in-law impressed. It was a small lie, a hairline fracture, but in my world, that's where the collapse starts. Julian stood up again, his glass catching the light of the chandelier like a jagged tooth. To the man who taught me everything about what not to do, he announced, his voice ringing with a cruel, polished edge. The guests, those high society vultures in silk and gold, leaned in their laughter, ready and waiting. To my father, the only man I know who treats a savings account like a religious relic and a 2009 sedan like a high-performance machine. He gestured toward the window, toward my charcoal car sitting in the driveway, like a blemish on the estate's perfection. That car is a monument to fear Dad. Image isn't just vanity in the heights. It's the currency of the world you're far too afraid to join. The socialites erupted in high-pitched, jagged laughter that didn't sound like joy. It sounded like an execution. I felt the cold, damp stem of my wine glass against my fingers, but I didn't drink. I just watched my son, wondering when the boy I raised had decided that the shine on the hood was more important than the strength of the axle. Do you know what happens to a bolt when you over-tighten it just to make it look flush? It shears. Julian was tightening the threads of his own life, and I could hear the metal groaning. Vanessa didn't let the moment pass. She adjusted her diamond necklace, her eyes tracking the movement of the staff as they cleared the beef. I honestly didn't think people still lived in Rock Hill by choice, she said, her voice a soft, melodic insult. I had to spend months re-educating Julian on the finer things. His father's influence was like a heavy weight, keeping him tethered to a starter home that stayed a home for far too long. Garrett laughed, a deep booming sound that shook the crystal. It's about having a vision. Vanessa, he said, looking at me with a pity that felt like a slap. Some people are just born to look at the ground. Others are born to own the horizon. I sat in perfect silence, my mind already calculating the structural failure of the mortgage I had secretly funded. How many times can you erase a father from the blueprints before the whole structure loses its balance? They were laughing at the man who provided the very floor they were standing on, oblivious to the fact that I held the keys to the demolition. Before I reveal the detail about this birthday gift that changes everything I want to know, are you still with me? If you're still here, please comment the word foundation to let me know you're still part of this journey. And a quick note, what follows contains some recreated details for narrative purposes. And the message is, what I truly hope stays with you. If you prefer not to continue with these adjusted details, you may choose to stop the video right here. Julian signaled for the dessert with a sharp snap of his fingers. The room went quiet, the guests expecting a masterpiece from a high-end pastry chef. Instead, a server walked in, carrying a cheap plastic-domed cake. The sound of the plastic crinkling in the silence was deafening, a harsh, low-rent noise in a room designed for whispers. As the server set it down, I saw the neon yellow manager's special sticker still clinging to the side, marking the price at $9.99. The smell of synthetic vanilla and cheap frosting began to compete with the wood-heavy cologne in the air. "We thought we'd get you something you'd actually recognize," Dad, Julian said, his grin widening as the guests began to titter. "Consider it a token of your modest achievements. We didn't want to overwhelm your tax bracket." The neon yellow sticker on that plastic cake dome was the brightest thing in the room, a beacon of my son's absolute failure as a man. It was the ultimate social insult designed to put me in my place once and for all. I looked at the sticker, the yellow glow reflecting in the polished mahogany of the table. Garrett was chuckling, leaning back with a look of supreme triumph. But then I looked at the server. It was the same man who had handed Garrett the legal subpoena earlier. The man didn't leave. He stood by the sideboard, and for a split second, he caught my eye. He gave me a subtle knowing nod, a professional acknowledgement between two men who knew exactly how much weight a structure could actually carry. The laughter was a jagged thing, but it was about to be cut short. I felt the sharp edge of the folded paper in my jacket pocket, the one I'd been carrying like a hidden blade all evening. I looked at the manager's special sticker, then at Julian's grinning face, and I reached into my jacket pocket for the folded paper that would end his little play forever. The slow, invisible rot had finally reached the surface, and I was ready to pull the lever on the whole facade. The paper didn't make a sound as it slid across the polished wood, but to me, it felt like the heavy strike of a demolition ball hitting a hollow wall. I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and unhurried, as the silence following the arrival of that cheap discounted cake stretched until it became a physical weight in the room. Julian's grin was still plastered on his face, but his eyes were darting around looking for the next laugh that wouldn't come. I ignored the waxy artificial smell of the grocery store frosting and the neon yellow sticker that had been meant as my badge of shame. "I think you've forgotten the cost of the ground you're standing on." "Julian," I said, my voice echoing with the same cold, technical precision I had used to sign off on structural failures for nearly half a century. I let the document settle in front of him. Check the date. December 12th, 3 years ago. $82,000. It came from my boring savings account and went directly into the fund you needed to close on this very house. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to hollow out. The laughter of the guests died mid-breath, leaving a heavy-weighted silence where 20 people suddenly held their breath. I leaned forward, my hands resting on the cold, sharp edge of the mahogany table. "I didn't just wire you that money, Julian. I set up a silent lien on this property through a third-party trust. It was a structural safety measure. It means I technically own a larger share of this house than you or Garrett ever realized. The truth is a heavy thing. When it drops, it doesn't just break the surface, it shatters the foundation." I watched the realization ripple through the room like a shockwave. Vanessa reached for the paper, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, her face drained of all color, her lips a thin line of trembling resolve. "Julian," she whispered the name, sounding like a plea. "You told me your commissions paid for the down payment. You told me your father had nothing, and that we were building this on the Vance legacy." Julian stammered, his eyes wide, and panicked, looking toward Garrett for a support beam that was no longer there. It was just... the timing was off, Vanessa. "I was going to tell you, but the image mattered, remember? Garrett said the image was everything." Garrett Vance remained eerily still, his deep tan looking like a mask of dried clay. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at his daughter. He looked at the receipt I had provided, and I saw his fingers twitch against the stem of his wine glass. The social currency of the room was shifting away from my son. In real time, the guests now, whispering behind their hands, their eyes no longer full of pity for me, but of sharp, predatory interest in the collapse of the host. How does it feel to realize the person you've been looking down on is the only thing keeping you from the dirt? I turned my focus directly to Garrett. "You didn't think I'd check the audit trails, Garrett," I asked. "I've spent my life looking for what's hidden behind the paint and the gold leaf. You were an easy find. I knew exactly where that money was going, because your name was on the joint transfer notification. You sat here tonight and watched my son mock me for having a small pension mindset, all while you were quite literally living off my quiet labor. Julian, look at your father-in-law. Ask him why he stayed quiet while you made me the punchline of your little joke." Julian looked at Garrett, a look of profound betrayal crossing his features. But Garrett's silence was absolute. The man was a master of the exit strategy, and I could see him already mentally distancing himself from the wreckage of Julian's reputation. I reached back into my jacket pocket, my movements slow and surgical. The 82,000 was just the first structural crack I intended to expose tonight. The foundation was already groaning under the weight of the lies, and I was about to add the final load. The room felt like it was undergoing a sudden, violent seismic shift, and Garrett Vance was the only one without a safety harness. Vanessa was still staring at the receipt, but then she looked up at her father, her eyes flashing with a sudden pained clarity. "I suspected it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but cutting through the murmurs of the guests. "I found your signature on a private mortgage document months ago, Dad. I thought it was just your way of helping us. I was too afraid of the Vance reputation to ask the questions I knew the answers to." She looked at Julian, then back at me, and I saw the first genuine emotion from her, all evening a deep, searing shame. I felt a cold, relentless power. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it because a bridge that cannot hold the truth shouldn't be allowed to stand. I pulled the second document from my pocket, the one I had been holding in reserve. This one wasn't a receipt. It was a consolidated statement of my actual net worth, a figure that made Julian's borrowed lifestyle look like a child's lemonade stand. Vanessa turned her pained gaze toward her father, and as I pulled the second document, the one with the $1.8 million figure from my pocket, I knew the demolition was only beginning. The The guests leaned in the silence so absolute I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The performative wealth of the Heights was about to meet the unshakable reality of 40 years of discipline. I looked at Garrett, seeing the sweat finally breaking through his tan, and I realized I hadn't just come here to survive the dinner. I had come to tear the whole house down. I didn't rush. When you're performing a controlled demolition, haste is how you get people killed. Precision is how you make sure the right things crumble. I stood there, the second document gripped between my fingers, while Vanessa's pained gaze remained fixed on her father. The dining room was so silent I could hear the hum of the climate control system and the frantic, shallow rhythm of Julian's breathing. I leaned forward and placed the second ledger on the polished mahogany. "This isn't a receipt, Julian," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of unshakable discipline. "This is a consolidated investment statement. It shows a portfolio worth $1.85 million in liquid assets, not debt, not leverage, ownership." I watched the color drain from the faces around the table. Julian stared at the number, his eyes darting across the itemized list of index funds, blue-chip stocks, and municipal bonds. "You asked what I've built, Julian. This is 35 years of saying no to things I didn't need, so I could say yes to your freedom. You spent your energy leasing an image. I spent mine owning the companies that leased it to you. I didn't stay at that boring job for 40 years because I lacked vision. I stayed because the pension plan was one of the last in the country offering a 100% inflation-adjusted match. You mocked the math you never bothered to understand. Have you ever noticed that the loudest engines are usually the ones that are about to blow a gasket? Garrett Vance was the loudest engine in this room, but now he looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. I turned the page of the ledger, pointing to the quarterly dividend column. "This pile of pension checks, as you called it, pays out more in a passive monthly yield than your fancy wool blazer cost in a year. I don't drive a 15-year-old car because I'm forced to, Julian. I drive it because I don't have to prove my worth to people who don't matter. My net worth isn't a performance, it's a foundation." Julian reached out his hand, trembling as he touched the edge of the paper. "This can't be right," he whispered, though. The bank's official watermark was staring him in the face. "You lived like we were struggling." I looked at my son, feeling a flash of the old pity. "We were never struggling, Julian. You were just blind to the difference between wealth and its shadow." I saw the guests shifting in their seats, their eyes no longer full of mockery. They were looking at me with a mix of greed and a sudden terrifying respect. Silence didn't just fall, it crashed. I wasn't finished with the audit. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp as a hammer strike. Beyond the liquid assets, I also own 2 rental properties in Rock Hill, both fully paid for and generating steady cash flow. I built foundations, Julian. Real ones. Not glass towers held up by high-interest hope and co-signed lies. I looked Garrett Vance directly in the eye. He was leaning back, trying to maintain a shred of his earlier arrogance, but his sweat was beginning to turn the collar of his designer shirt a darker shade of blue. A bridge inspector builds things, even when he's not on the clock, Garrett. We look for structural integrity. I saw that the local park where Julian used to play was going to be sold to a developer years ago. I was the anonymous donor who matched the city's fund to save it. You tried to take credit for that at the country club last spring, didn't you? Garrett's jaw tightened, but no sound came out. The room was a vacuum of shock. Vanessa looked from the ledger to me, her eyes wet with a realization that was almost too heavy to bear. She had spent years believing her father was the provider, and mine was the burden, the $1. $8 million figure on that paper was a lighthouse, and every single person at this table was suddenly realizing they were steering a sinking ship. The itemized breakdown of my wealth was the final load test, and the Heights estate had failed, but that wasn't the worst of it. I reached into my jacket again, slower this time, letting the silence stretch until it pressed against every face at the table. "There's something else you should look at," I said. I slid a second document across the table. Not a statement, not a receipt. A signature record. Julian frowned, his hands shaking as he picked it up. "That's my name." "It is," I said. "Dated 6 months ago. On a refinancing agreement tied to Garrett's Northridge project." The room went completely still. "You told me you never signed anything beyond your mortgage." I continued, my voice calm, precise. "But this says otherwise." Julian's breathing turned uneven. I didn't. Garrett said it was just paperwork, just temporary leverage. "You signed a personal guarantee," I cut in. "Not for your home, for his debt." I let that settle. "If that project collapses, Julian, you don't just lose this house." I met his eyes. "You lose everything attached to your name." I saw my son's worldview shatter in real time. Everything he had used to justify his disrespect, the car, the suit, the modest bungalow, had been revealed as a choice rather than a necessity. He realized he'd been mocking a giant from the safety of a borrowed hill. I stood tall, feeling the understated power of my position. I didn't need their applause or their apologies. I only needed the truth to be the last thing standing. Garrett, however, was already pivoting. I watched the greed bloom in his eyes like a fast-acting mold. His predatory instinct was overriding his embarrassment. He began to lean forward, his hands unfolding from his chest, his mind clearly calculating how to turn my assets into his next acquisition. And he wasn't looking at me as a man he'd insulted. He was looking at me as a fresh source of air for his suffocating empire. But he didn't know that I had already seen the cracks in his own beams. I looked around the table at the faces that had pitied me minutes ago, but my eyes landed on Garrett, whose expression wasn't one of shock. It was the look of a predator seeing a fresh source of air. He thought he could spin this. He thought he could invite me into the fold and use my 35 years of discipline to patch his own rotting hull. He was about to find out that a bridge inspector doesn't just find the rust. He condemns the entire structure when it's too far gone to save. I watched the greed bloom in Garrett's eyes like a fast-acting mold, his predatory instinct overriding his embarrassment before the echoes of my revelation had even died down. The heavy silence of the dining room didn't last long, once the weight of $1.8 million settled into the collective consciousness of the guests. Garrett leaned forward, his hands unfolding from his chest and spreading across the mahogany table in a gesture of sudden, unearned kinship. "Thane, my friend, I had no idea you were such a shark," he boomed, his voice regaining that oily, charismatic resonance. "We really should talk. A portfolio with that kind of liquidity, well, it's wasted sitting in index funds. We're in the middle of the Northridge expansion. With your capital and my vision, we could double that in 18 months. He laughed, a sound that was meant to be infectious, but felt to me like the grind of a failing bearing. I saw him try to dismiss the earlier insults with a casual wave of his hand, reframing his mockery as a test of my character. I remained icy, my hands resting flat on the table, watching him scramble to reframe a narrative that had already turned to ash. "I'm not a shark, Garrett," I said, my voice cutting through his performance like a cold wind. "I'm an inspector. I don't look for blood, I look for rust. And from where I'm sitting, your whole structure is oxidizing from the inside out. A shark in a shallow pool is just a big fish waiting to suffocate." Garrett's smile faltered the corners of his mouth, twitching as he realized I wasn't biting. I leaned in the movement, causing the crystal chandelier above to cast sharp, jagged shadows across the renderings of his resort. "You mentioned Northridge." I continued my technical memory, bringing up the logs I'd reviewed just last week. "It's funny you should mention it. I stay current with the State Bridge Authority logs force of habit. I saw the private reports on your boutique resort. The concrete in those secondary supports hasn't even cured, and it's already spalling. You didn't just cut corners on the materials, Garrett. You cut the throat of the whole structural design. You used substandard rebar from a supplier I blacklisted a decade ago. That project isn't an expansion, it's a liability. In fact, it's currently under a stop work order that I'm fairly certain your investors and your family haven't heard about yet." Garrett's face didn't just pale this time. It turned a shade of gray that matched the spalling concrete I was describing. "That's a lie," he shouted, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the wine glasses danced. "A temporary setback, a misunderstanding with a bureaucrat. How many lies do you have to tell yourself before you start believing the echo is the truth?" Vanessa looked at her father, her expression shifting from pained realization to outright horror. Julian was staring at the table, his mouth slightly agape, finally seeing the man he had worshipped for what he truly was. I wasn't finished. I reached out and tapped the white envelope that Garrett had been trying to hide all evening. "You're worried about bureaucrats, Garrett. You should be worried about the bank." I recognized that logo. Piedmont Wealth Management. It's the same institution where I hold my majority shares. I know their risk management protocols. That notice in your pocket isn't an invitation to a gala. It's a severing of your credit line. I know for a fact your primary lender has pulled the plug. I delivered the final blow with surgical precision, feeling the bitter metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. "You're not looking for a partner, Garrett. You're looking for a life raft. And you were planning on letting your own son-in-law drown, just to keep yourself dry. You were going to use Julian's house, the one I paid for, as a final tether to keep your creditors at bay while you looked for an exit." Garrett's empire was a bridge built of matchsticks, and I had just lit the first fire. He sat there, his chest heaving with heavy wheezing breaths, the smell of cold steak and desperate sweat filling the small space between us. I noticed a detail I hadn't shared yet, a piece of information I'd been holding in reserve. You thought you were being clever with those smaller Rock Hill properties, didn't you? The ones you used to bridge the gap last quarter. I bought out that distressed debt months ago, Garrett. I'm not your partner. I'm your secret landlord. I watched him absorb the information, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a hidden exit. You think I just found out tonight? I said quietly. Julian froze. I saw the transfer trail the day it happened. Your name, his account, the structure of the deal. I paused, letting the weight of it land. I didn't stop you. His head snapped up. Why? I held his gaze. Because I needed to know whether you'd come to me, or whether you'd keep walking deeper into something you didn't understand. I exhaled slowly. Now I have my answer. The bank didn't just send you a notice, I said, leaning back as the finality of the collapse set in. They sent you an eviction of your entire identity. Julian, your father-in-law, didn't approve your marriage because of your sales record. He told me himself in a moment of panicked rage earlier this year. He thought you had access to old Garrison money that he could eventually tap into. You weren't a protege, Julian. You were a line item in a bankruptcy filing. Garrett's face twisted into something unrecognizable, his mask of success finally melting away to reveal the desperate bankrupt man underneath. His eyes were strained and unfocused, his composure completely shattered. The room was a vacuum of shock, the socialite guests now looking at him with the same cold detachment they had once reserved for me. Garrett didn't reach for an argument. He didn't even try to lie anymore. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical weight. And then he said the one thing that made something in me go completely still. His voice was a low, jagged rasp that cut through the silence of the room. You think you're so righteous, Thane. You think those millions make you a man. He laughed, a hollow, terrifying sound. Ellen didn't die proud of your index funds. She died wondering why her husband was too cheap to give her a life worth living. I felt the vibration of the table as Garrett slammed his fist down again, but this time the world seemed to go completely still. The insult to my wife's memory was the final structural failure. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, my icy determination shifting into a protective rage that I knew would end this evening once and for all. Garrett didn't reach for an argument. He reached for a knife, his words meant to sever the only thing I had left of my wife. He sat there, his mask of success finally melting away to reveal the desperate bankrupt man underneath. And then he said the one thing that froze the moment in place. Ellen didn't die proud of your index funds. He had hissed, his voice a jagged rasp. She died wondering why her husband was too cheap to give her a life worth living. You think you're a hero because you saved a few million. You let Ellen die in a government-funded bed while you sat on your hoard like a dragon. I felt the white-hot fury peak in my chest, a structural load I wasn't sure my own heart could carry. I maintained a terrifying icy silence that made the entire room go still. The socialite guests suddenly realizing that Garrett had crossed an unforgivable line. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I looked at the man who had harvested my son's loyalty and realized he was nothing more than a hollowed-out pylon, rusted through and ready to collapse. Be very careful with your next breath, Garrett, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the mahogany table. It's the only thing you actually own right now. Have you ever felt a silence so heavy it makes your bones ache? That was the sound of a family bond snapping. I stood up, my presence commanding the room more than any of Garrett's rehearsed speeches ever could. I didn't look at the cheap, untouched cake sitting in its plastic dome, like a monument to Julian's betrayal. I looked directly at my son. Julian was staring at me, his eyes wide and glassy, the reality of Garrett's cruelty finally piercing through the fog of his ambition. I didn't build a pile of money, Julian. I said, each word a heavy stone being laid into place. I built a life of integrity. I built a fortress of security so that when the world decided to shake, you wouldn't be the one buried in the rubble. But you just traded that fortress for a view of the golf course and a man who would sell your soul to pay his interest rates. I won't finance disrespect, Julian. And I won't stand in a house where my wife's memory is treated as a weapon because you were too blind to see the rot in your own foyer. He tried to speak, to stammer out an apology, but I held up my hand. The inspection is over. Don't call me until you're ready to talk to your father, not your benefactor. I am closing the door, Julian. It's up to you to decide if you have the strength to knock. Respect isn't a gift. It's a structure you build brick by brick. I didn't move right away. Not yet. You asked me what I built. I said, looking at Julian one last time. I built something that doesn't collapse when people stop clapping. I gestured lightly toward Garrett, and tonight, you saw the difference. I picked up my coat. Everything you're afraid of losing? I paused at the doorway. You already put it at risk the moment you chose him over the truth. Then I left. I walked through the opulent foyer, the cold marble clicking beneath my shoes, and I didn't look back. I could hear the murmur of the guests, the sound of a social structure dissolving, as the Vance empire lost its last foothold. Julian followed me out onto the porch, the cold bite of the December air hitting us like a physical blow. "Dad, wait!" he shouted, his voice cracking in the dark. I didn't know about the Northridge safety issues. Garrett told me it was just red tape. I stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face him one last time. It doesn't matter what he told you, Julian. It matters what you were willing to believe, because it served your ego. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. I handed him the spare key to the Rock Hill bungalow, the one he had secretly used as collateral for Garrett's failing dreams. I already removed the lien myself. I told him, my voice as cold as the wind whipping across the lawn. I paid off the loan weeks ago. I kept the paperwork secret to see if you would ever have the courage to tell me the truth. You didn't. Julian looked at the key in his palm as if it were a piece of radioactive waste. The lights of the Heights estate looked like dying stars in my mirror, pretty from a distance, but cold as ice. I climbed into my 2009 sedan, the engine turning over with a reliable, honest roar that felt like a rebuke to the silence I was leaving behind. As I put the car in gear and began to pull away, the gravel under my tires sounded like the end of an era. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a final flickering image through the high windows of the mansion. Vanessa was standing in the center of the foyer, her face a mask of resolve, as she pointed toward the door, throwing Garrett out of the house. The Vance alliance hadn't just fractured, it had undergone a total structural failure. I watched my son standing on the porch, a small, diminishing figure under the flickering orange glow of a street lamp, still holding the key to a house he no longer deserved to enter. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the roar of my old engine, the only thing drowning out the sound of my son's voice shouting my name into the dark. I felt the metallic taste of rage in my throat, but beneath it there was a profound, hollow loneliness. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own family. I drove down the winding roads of the Heights, passing the manicured lawns and the silent, dark houses of people who traded their truth for a zip code. I realized that the bridge I had spent my life building for Julian wasn't the one he wanted, and the one I had just burned was the only path we had left to each other. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving toward the dark woods of South Carolina, my knuckles white and my jaw set. A man with $1.8 million in the bank and not a single soul left to share a birthday cake with. The road back to Rock Hill is 30 miles of dark asphalt. But tonight, each mile felt like a suture being pulled through an open wound I'd been hiding for years. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the roar of my old engine, the only thing drowning out the sound of my son's voice shouting my name into the dark. Behind me, the Heights estate was a dying constellation, its artificial brilliance flickering in the rearview mirror until the trees finally swallowed it whole. I watched the illuminated silhouette of the grand houses disappear, and for a moment, I felt the structural irony of that entire neighborhood. Those mansions were built to impress strangers, fortresses of glass and ego, while the families inside were left to crumble from the slow rot of neglect. I had spent my career measuring the strength of concrete and steel, but tonight I had finally measured the strength of my own bloodline, and the reading was a total failure. It was a beautiful view, Ellen, I whispered to the empty passenger seat. But there's no one left on the balcony. I did what I had to. I spoke the truth that needed to be spoken. So, why does it feel like I'm the one buried in the rubble of the bridge I just deliberately demolished? My thumbs traced the worn, notched leather of the steering wheel. I could feel the deep scratches at the 10 and 2 positions marks made by Julian's fingernails nearly 2 decades ago. I had been teaching him to drive in this very car, and he had gripped the wheel with a terrified intensity as we navigated the back roads of the county. It was a tactile memory of a bond that Julian had just disowned in favor of a man who viewed him as a line item on a bankruptcy filing. Every vibration of the car felt like a heartbeat. The smell of pine trees and cold, damp asphalt drifted through the vents as I left the city's artificial glow behind. If a bridge falls in the middle of the night and there's no one left to cross it, did it ever really exist at all? I wondered if Julian would even recognize the silence of his own house now that the Vance name had been stripped of its gold leaf. The city lights in the distance looked like teeth sharp and hungry, but out here in the dark woods of South Carolina, the air was honest. I focused on the rhythmic hum of my 2009 sedan, finding sanctuary in the simplicity of its engineering. There was no turbocharger screaming for attention, no sensors telling me I was drifting from my lane, no performance-based software trying to hide the reality of the road. It was just steel spark and the steady movement of pistons. I appreciated the honesty of it. I compared the car's worn-out but reliable components to Julian's least high-pressured life, and I realized that sometimes the old ways are the only ways that don't quit on you when the load gets too heavy. The atmospheric pressure of social performance, the need to wear the right suit, the need to smile at Garrett's lies, was finally lifting. My ears popped as the elevation shifted the red taillights of the few cars ahead, stretching into the dark horizon like tracers. The city lights in the distance looked like teeth, sharp and hungry. I was moving away from the carnivores, retreating to the bunker I had spent 35 years reinforcing with discipline and $2 million of hidden silence. By the time I reached the outskirts of Rock Hill, the midnight chill had settled over the fields. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my brick bungalow, the sound of the stones under my tires feeling like a grounding wire. My bungalow wasn't just a house. It was a bunker built of 35 years of discipline and $2 million of hidden silence. I stood on the porch for a long minute, the keys cold in my hand. I listened to the absolute silence of a house that was fully paid for a structure that owed no one an explanation and required no performance to maintain. It was a peace that shouldn't have felt this loud. I turned the key, hearing the heavy, satisfying click of the deadbolt sliding home, locking the world of the heights on the other side. I stepped into the dark living room, the familiar scent of old books and lemon wax welcoming me back. But before I could even shrug off the scratchy wool of my suit jacket, a dull vibration started against my hip. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The blue electronic glare was blinding in the shadows of the room. It was Julian. Again. "Not tonight, Julian," I said to the empty room. "I've finished the inspection." I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter, but the vibration continued, a rhythmic buzzing that sounded like a trapped insect. It felt like a live wire pulsing with a desperate rhythm I knew was his attempt to reach for the safety net I had just pulled away. I turned my back on it, moving toward the front door to check the mail I'd ignored earlier. That was when I saw it. Resting on the porch mat was a small, heavy package wrapped in plain brown paper. I brought it inside and sat at the kitchen table, the phone still buzzing a few feet away. I tore the paper back to reveal a vintage bridge survey map of the York County area from 1952, a rare museum-quality piece of history. There was a small white card tucked into the corner with familiar, elegant handwriting. It was from Pamela Vanessa's mother. The phone in my pocket felt like a live wire, pulsing with a desperate rhythm I knew was Julian's, but it was the small handwritten card attached to Pamela's gift that stopped my heart. I stared at the ink, the words glowing in the blue light of my still vibrating phone. "You were the only one who saw the cracks before the bridge was even built," it read. "Please don't let the collapse take you down with them." I realized then that I wasn't the only one who had been keeping watch in the dark. I let the phone buzz until the foyer went silent again, the electronic vibration a desperate heartbeat that I was finally brave enough to ignore. The house was cold, but it was a clean cold free of the humid, suffocating pretense that had choked the air in the heights. I stood in the dark, my hands finally starting to tremble as the adrenaline from the dinner began its slow, painful retreat. I walked into the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my feet, like a bridge settling into its foundations after a heavy storm. On the counter lay the package Pamela had left on my porch. I opened it with fingers that felt thick and clumsy, uncovering a vintage bridge survey map of the York County area from 1952. The smell of old parchment and library dust wafted up a comforting scent that anchored me back to the reality of stone and steel. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a card. I read her elegant handwriting under the dim light of the stove. "He was never a builder Thane," she wrote. "He was just a decorator of debt. Thank you for being the only man in that room with a real spine. Thank you for finally providing the wrecking ball I wasn't strong enough to swing myself." I ran my thumb over the edge of the frame, feeling the solid wood. That was when I felt it, a slight unnatural bump in the spine of the backing. I pried the edge back and a small, cold metallic thumb drive slid out onto the counter. Pamela hadn't just sent me a thank you note. She had sent me the ledger. She had handed me the actual internal documents of Garrett's business, the evidence of every cut corner and forged signature he'd used to maintain his house of cards. Is a bridge still standing if no one is allowed to cross it? Or is it just a monument to a path that's been closed? I sat at the kitchen table, the digital drive glowing blue in the dark. The rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock was the only sound in the room, steady and unyielding. The silence was heavy, almost physical. I finally reached up and began to unbutton my scratchy wool suit jacket, stripping off the uniform of the birthday guest who had stayed too long. I sat there for hours, the immediate high of the confrontation replaced by a massive physical and emotional crash. I thought about the 35 years I spent protecting Julian from the harshness of reality, hiding the grit and the grind so he could have a life of smooth surfaces. I realize now that I didn't just build a portfolio, I built a monster who thought he was a king because I never let him see the dirt under the throne. How did I miss the rot in my own son? I had spent my life looking for hairline fractures and 60-ton beams. Yet I had let the support system of my own legacy crumble right in front of me. I looked at the phone on the counter as it lit up again, Julian's name flickering like a dying bulb. I didn't reach for it. My hands shook, not from fear, from the weight of the silence. I spent New Year's Eve systematically enforcing the boundaries I should have set decades ago. I took my phone and placed it in a deep kitchen drawer, sliding it shut on Julian's endless buzzing apologies and demands for explanations. I needed a period of absolute silence to perform the forensic audit on the thumb drive. As the sun began to set on the final day of 2024, I walked out onto my front porch. The air was crisp, tasting of frost and cedar. I sat in my old wooden chair watching the shadows stretch across the gravel driveway. My house was fully paid for. It owed no one an explanation. It required no performance to maintain. As midnight approached, I heard the distant muffled pop of fireworks from the country club miles away. They were bright, loud, and gone in a second, leaving nothing but smoke and an empty sky. The fireworks looked like the very vision Garrett had sold, a temporary dazzle built on air. I stayed on my porch in the cold, listening to the countdown that I knew was happening in living rooms all across the county. 10, 9, 8. Happy New Year to a man who finally knows his own worth, I whispered. The year ahead would be one of demolition and reconstruction, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dust. I looked at the digital drive Pamela had sent, the cold metal feeling like a detonator in my palm. By staying silent and not answering those calls, I was doing more than just protecting my peace. I realized that my silence was actually triggering a morality clause I had written into the secret trust I set up for Julian years ago. That trust required a documented period of family stability and professional integrity for the funds to remain accessible. By using my home as collateral for a fraud, Julian had officially forfeited his right to the foundation I had built for him. He was standing on a bridge that was about to be dismantled piece by piece by the very man who had designed it. I stood up and walked back into the house, the cold wood of the porch floor solid beneath my feet. I didn't need the fireworks or the champagne. I had the truth, and in the world of an inspector, that is the only thing that ever survives the load test. I closed the drawer on my buzzing phone and looked at the digital drive Pamela had sent, realizing I held the detonator for the last pillar of Julian's borrowed world. The new year was starting, and the first thing on my list was to make sure the right things stayed standing while the rot was cleared away for good. I didn't spend New Year's Day nursing a hangover. I spent it in my study tracing the spiderweb of Garrett's debt until I found the exact thread that would bring the whole thing down. The blue light from the monitors reflected off my glasses as I performed a digital autopsy on the files Pamela had provided. I had closed the drawer on my buzzing phone hours ago, choosing the cold clarity of data over the desperate noise of Julian's apologies. The internal ledgers were a masterpiece of deception, but to an inspector trained to see the stress points in a structure, the rot was glaring. Garrett Vance wasn't a builder, he was a juggler. He had been layering debt for years using capital from new resort projects to pay the spiraling interest on older failing ones. It was a classic Ponzi-style real estate scheme, a house of cards held together by expensive stationery. Most shockingly, I found the mezzanine loan documents for the failed Northridge project. Julian's personal credit had been used to guarantee the high-risk debt. "You didn't just borrow money, Garrett," I whispered to the dark room. "You harvested my son's future like a cash crop. This isn't business, it's a suicide pact." I realized then that my defensive measures needed to be as aggressive as Garrett's fraud. I had actually triggered a formal red flag report to the credit rating agencies regarding Garrett's primary steel supplier months ago, a move based on the structural flaws I'd seen in his earlier procurement logs. By the time Garrett needed more credit, their rating had collapsed, and my own portfolio gained from the market shift away from those toxic assets. While Garrett was busy drowning, his failure was already turning into a direct profit for my secret portfolio. It was a cold calculation, but the math of survival rarely leaves room for sentiment. I spent the morning watching the scrolling blue text of the digital ledgers reveal the full extent of the collapse. Garrett had built a bridge out of shadows, and he had convinced my son to stand right in the middle of it. Garrett wasn't a captain steering a ship. He was a parasite who had convinced the host that the sickness was actually growth. The hum of the desktop computer's cooling fan was the only sound in my small study as I finalized my report. I felt a calculated fury rising in my chest. I had spent 35 years ensuring that Julian would never have to see the bottom of a ledger, and Garrett had repaid that protection by turning my son into a human shield for his own bankruptcy. The following morning, I drove to the Regional Wealth Management office. The bright clinical white of the bank's marble floors echoed with the sound of my sensible shoes. Marcus Thorne, a man whose skin was the color of old parchment and whose suits were as sharp and humorless as a ledger, greeted me with the cautious respect reserved for the bank's most liquid clients. He led me to a private conference room that smelled of roasted coffee beans and expensive paper. I sat across from him and laid out my requirements. I want these assets moved into restricted trusts. Immediately, I told him my voice flat and final. I want a structural lock that ensures Julian cannot touch the principal, even in the event of my death. I'm firewalling what I've built from the mounting liabilities my son has co-signed. I also want a formal intent to foreclose placed on the Rock Hill properties Garrett used as leverage. I intend to be first in line when the bankruptcy hits. Marcus looked at the figures on the screen, a slight tremor in his hand, betraying his surprise at the sheer volume of my liquid assets. Mr. Garrison, this is a very aggressive protective stance, he said, adjusting his glasses. Are you sure? What good is a foundation if the man living on top of it is determined to set the roof on fire? I watched Marcus process the paperwork, the cold efficiency of the bank acting as a balm to my nerves. I was no longer just a father watching a tragedy. I was an inspector, condemning a faulty structure. If my son's world burns, I won't have the fire spreading to what I've built, I replied. I'm protecting the foundation, Marcus. That's what I do. By the time I left the bank, the financial shields were locked. I had spent 30 years hiding the size of my mountain, and now that mountain was a fortress that could weather any storm. I drove back to Rock Hill, the winter sun, reflecting off the windshield of my sedan, feeling the weight of the upcoming collapse. A few days later, I sat in a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. The smell of roasted beans was a welcome distraction from the heavy silence of my bungalow. I pulled out my tablet and saw the headline I had been waiting for: Northridge Resort halted amid safety concerns and funding gaps. I read the article, slowly savoring the technical accuracy of the failure. The news is just catching up to what the Steel already told me I thought. The article detailed the Vance Empire's sudden liquidity crisis. I knew Julian was likely panicking his phone, probably ringing with calls from creditors he couldn't pay. But the silence I was maintaining was the only thing keeping him from making a final mistake. Let them scream. Silence is the only thing Garrett can't negotiate with. The ink on the headline was still wet. The blood in the water was already cold. I scrolled through the supplemental files on the drive one last time. That was when I found a document I had missed. It was a hidden PDF titled Asset Protection. My breath hitched as I opened it. It was a secret life insurance policy Garrett had taken out on Julian. The payout was astronomical. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian wasn't a partner. He was a sacrificial lamb with a signature. Garrett had planned for the collapse from the beginning, ensuring that Julian was worth more to him broken than successful. I stared at the insurance policy, the cold numbers proving that Julian wasn't a partner. He was a sacrificial lamb with a signature. I watched through the slats of my blinds as a luxury SUV I didn't recognize idled in my gravel driveway, its engine purring with a wealth that had no business in this neighborhood. I recognized the model, one of the high-end German imports Julian used to covet, but the way it was parked skewed and hesitant suggested a driver who had lost their sense of direction. I had spent weeks in surgical isolation, fortifying my financial walls and dissecting the rot in Garrett Vance's ledgers, and I knew the first outside contact would likely be a desperate one. I stared at the insurance policy Garrett had taken out on my son, the cold numbers proving that Julian wasn't a partner. He was a sacrificial lamb with a signature. I slid the document into a drawer just as the engine cut out, leaving a heavy, unnatural silence in the yard. Vanessa stepped out of the car, and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman who had once treated my home like a transit station. She looked disheveled, stripped of the designer polish and the calculated sharp edges she wore at the birthday dinner. Her hair was windblown, her eyes were rimmed with red, and her posture radiated a crushing weight of shame. She stood on my porch for a long minute, her hand hovering over the doorbell, as if she were afraid the electricity might burn her. I opened the door before she could knock, maintaining the structural integrity of my boundary by remaining behind the threshold. "Thane, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know where else to go. I looked at her then, at the modest brick of my bungalow. "This is a modest house, Vanessa." I said, my voice flat and steady. "It doesn't usually host people looking for an escape. You were quite clear about your opinion of Rock Hill when the wine was flowing." Vanessa's hands weren't shaking from the cold. They were shaking from the vacuum her father had left behind. She looked smaller than I remembered a fallen princess, whose kingdom had been revealed as a mirage. I saw the entry twist of her reality when she confessed a detail she had kept hidden. She revealed that Garrett had been intercepting my mail for months through a redirected P.O. box he'd forced Julian to sign for ensuring my son never saw the warning letters I had actually tried to send. He didn't just isolate Julian from the truth, Thane. He isolated him from you. I didn't immediately invite her in. I stood there weighing the cost of opening the door against the necessity of seeing the demolition through to the end. Finally, I stepped aside. She followed me into the kitchen, the clicking of her expensive heels sounding hollow and out of place on my linoleum floors. Over a cup of tea that she barely touched, Vanessa confessed the full extent of the vanishing act. "My father is gone," she said, staring into the steam. "He didn't even leave a note, just a stack of default notices and an empty safe. He fled the country last night." She explained that Garrett didn't just spend the money they made. He had systematically transferred every personal liability, every failed mezzanine loan, and every predatory debt onto Julian's business accounts. He was a parasite, Vanessa. I told her, my voice low. Parasites don't say goodbye. They just find a new host. She admitted that the Heights estate, the monument to Julian's ego, was being seized by the bank next week. Everything they owned was effectively a prop in a play that had just been canceled. How do you tell a woman that the man she worshipped as a god was actually just a con artist with a good tailor? I didn't try. I let the silence do the work. Vanessa dropped the final bombshell, the signature trap that Garrett had been set for years. Julian didn't just co-sign a mortgage Thane. He was tricked into signing an unlimited personal guarantee for the Northridge project. My father told him it was just a performance bond, but it was a trap. The predatory lenders aren't just taking the house and the cars. They're coming for Julian's future earnings. They're even coming after my design firm because of the way the accounts were linked. She leaned across the table, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic hope. "You have millions, Thane. Please. You can save him. You can pay them off, and we can pretend this never happened." I looked at her, feeling a cold, necessary logic settle in my marrow. Giving them money now would be like pouring water into a sieve. It makes a lot of noise, but nothing stays full. "I won't subsidize a collapse, Vanessa." I said the words as hard as granite. "I'll help you rebuild, but only after the dust settles. If I pay this debt, Garrett's creditors get rich and Julian learns nothing. He needs to see the bottom of the hole he helped dig." Vanessa looked toward the window, her voice barely a whisper, as she told me that Julian was waiting at the end of the block, terrified that the bridge back to his father had already been burned to the ground. She admitted that he was sitting in his car in a parking lot nearby, too ashamed to face me, and that she had come ahead to see if I would have him arrested or let him in. "He thinks you hate him," she said. "I don't hate him," I replied. "I'm just waiting for the man I raised to show up, instead of the shadow Garrett created." The air in the kitchen felt heavy with the weight of consequence. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock, a sound that usually brought me peace but now felt like a countdown. Vanessa stood up, her movement slow and weary. "I'll tell him to come," she said. "But Thane, he has nothing left." Good, I thought. That's the only way to ensure the new foundation is actually made of rock. I watched her walk back to her car. Her shoulders slumped, the luxury SUV looking like a lead weight as she pulled away. I stood at the door, the cold draft coming from the open front door chilling my bones, waiting for the sound of Julian's tires on the gravel. The reconstruction was about to begin, but first the last of the debris had to be cleared away. The crunch of gravel under Julian's tires sounded hesitant, almost like a man stepping onto a bridge he was certain would collapse under his weight. I stood on the porch of my bungalow, watching as the luxury sedan, now dusty and missing a hubcap, crept up the driveway. The silence that followed the engine cutting out was heavy thick with the stagnant air of a southern afternoon and the unspoken debris of the last few months. Vanessa had warned me he was close, but seeing him was different. Julian finally exited the car. He looked physically diminished. His shoulders slumped as if the expensive blazer he no longer wore had been the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't look at the house. He looked at his shoes. He stood there for a long time, the shadow of the person who had mocked my birthday cake. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "I'm so sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "I didn't just lose the money. I lost my way. I lost everything you tried to tell me." I didn't move from my spot behind the screen door. "Apologies are just paint, Julian," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the anger I'd spent months processing. "I'm interested in the steel underneath. I'm interested in whether there's anything left to build on." He walked toward the steps, and for the first time he noticed I wasn't wearing a suit. I was in my work clothes, heavy denim, and a faded thermal shirt. Have you ever noticed that a man's voice gets quieter the more he actually has to say? Julian's voice was barely a murmur as he reached the top step. He revealed the true depth of his fall then. He hadn't just lost the house, he had already signed over his remaining personal interest in his design firm to his creditors. He did it to shield Vanessa from the worst of the predatory guarantees Garrett had lured him into. He had arrived at my door with literally nothing but the clothes on his back and a car he couldn't afford the gas for. I didn't offer him a drink or a chair in the living room. I didn't give him the lecture he was clearly braced for. Instead, I walked to the shed and returned with a heavy iron rake. I handed it to him, the cold metal, a stark contrast to the touchscreen devices he had spent his life operating. "The backyard is a mess," I told him, pointing toward the acre of overgrown brush and deadfall behind the bungalow. "Start there. Don't just move the leaves, Julian. Find the roots." He looked at the rake, then at me, and for a second I saw the old flash of defiance in his eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by a grim, quiet acceptance. "Yes, sir," he said. For 3 hours, the only communication between us was the rhythmic scrape of metal against earth. I worked alongside him with a shovel, clearing the drainage ditch that had clogged during the spring rains. The sun beat down on us, the humidity clinging to our skin like a second layer of clothing. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He was clumsy at first, wielding the rake like a golf club, but as the blisters began to form, his movements became more purposeful. He was existing in the physical reality of hard work, stripped of the buffer of his old status symbols. There was no assistant to delegate to, no software to hide the errors. There was only the dirt and the effort. The rake hit a stone, sending a brief spark flying into the air. It was a real moment, sharp and honest, and I saw Julian stop to stare at the spot where the metal had met the rock. He looked exhausted, his face smeared with sweat and dust, but the frantic shifting energy he'd carried for years was starting to settle. He was finally standing on ground that didn't belong to a bank. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the newly cleared lot, Julian stopped. He sat on an old stump, his breath coming in heavy heaves. He looked at his hands, which were red and beginning to weep from the unaccustomed labor. I walked over and sat on the bench nearby, showing him my own palms. They were thick with yellowed calluses, the result of 40 years of inspections, maintenance, and refuse to let things rot. "You did this every day," Julian asked, his voice full of a new kind of wonder. "Even when you had the millions in the bank?" "Especially then," I replied. "Ownership is a responsibility, Julian, not a trophy. Real wealth is the ability to fix what you own rather than replacing it with something leased. Blisters are just the body's way of building a new foundation where the old skin wasn't tough enough to hold the weight." He nodded, actually listening now, finding a superior form of strength in the frugality he had once mocked as fear. He realized that my life wasn't a lack of vision, but a commitment to the structures that actually last. We moved toward the back corner of the fence line to clear the last of the briars. That was when Julian's rake caught on something metallic, buried deep in the soil. He knelt down, digging with his fingers, until he pulled up a small, rusted tin box. It was a time capsule we had planted 20 years ago, a childhood project I'd nearly forgotten. We sat in the dirt together as he pried the lid open. Inside were a few plastic soldiers, a coin from the year he was born, and a drawing he had made when he was 8 years old. It was a picture of a bridge, crude and colorful. I took it from him, feeling the familiar texture of the plastic laminate I had secretly applied to the paper before we buried it. I wanted to make sure it survived the damp, I told him. Julian held the drawing, his fingers tracing the edges my younger self had protected. I saw the first tear hit the dirt, a drop of water on a very dry foundation. He looked at the bridge he had drawn as a boy, then at the man who had ensured it didn't rot, and I knew the first rivet of our new life had been driven home. The physical labor was done for the day, but as I looked at the sunset reflecting in his eyes, I knew the intellectual accountability. The cold, hard math of his debt was the next bridge we had to cross together. I didn't offer Julian a chair. I offered him a yellow legal pad and a stack of his own credit card statements that I'd forced him to print out in the local library. The sun had long since set, leaving the backyard in a charcoal silhouette, and the transition to the kitchen table felt like moving from a primary stress test to a forensic structural audit. I watched Julian reach for the pad, his fingers still stained with the dark soil of the yard. His blistered palms made his grip clumsy, a physical manifestation of the friction he was finally feeling with reality. I led him to the kitchen table, now cleared of childhood memories and replaced with the cold evidence of adult failure. I sat across from him, the harsh fluorescent light overhead, casting deep, unforgiving shadows across the documents. Categorize it all, I said, my voice as flat as a field report. Every dinner, every club membership, every suit. Don't just look at the total, Julian. Write down the cost of that one bottle of champagne you bought to impress Garrett back in November. I watched him wince as he manually transcribed the figures. It felt like I was winning at the time, Dad. He whispered, the scratching of the ballpoint pen, the only other sound in the room. Winning is about what stays standing when the wind picks up, I replied. You were just buying the wind. Have you ever wondered why the bank's furniture is always heavier than your own? It's because they own the ground you're sitting on. I introduced a second column on the legal pad, the compounding interest. This was the math Julian had spent his entire life ignoring, the hidden rust that had been eating the heart out of his freedom while he was busy polishing the surface. I showed him the bloodletting. I calculated the monthly interest on his mezzanine loans and his high-limit cards, then translated that figure into hours of his own labor. Every month you're cutting your own veins just to keep Garrett's smile bright, I told him. He stared at the bottom line, his eyes widening. I'm paying $4,000 a month just in interest. That can't be right. The pen snapped in Julian's hand. The black ink leaked out slowly, looking like a fresh bruise on the yellow paper. It's exactly right, I said. You've been working 60 hours a week just to pay for the privilege of being Garrett Vance's human shield. I sat back, letting the weight of the numbers settle into the silence of the kitchen. I revealed a detail I had kept in reserve for over a year. I haven't just been watching you, Julian. I've been tracking your spending through public lien records and credit alerts for 12 months. I knew you were failing long before the birthday dinner. I saw the cracks in the foundation before you even felt the floor vibrate. Julian looked up at me, his face a mask of shock and a sudden sharp sense of exposure. You knew, and you let me keep going. I am an inspector, Julian. I can tell you a bridge is going to fail, but I can't stop you from driving your truck onto it if you're determined to ignore the signs. You needed to feel the sway. I watched him process the betrayal of my silence, but I could see the humiliating clarity of the math finally overriding his ego. He looked back at the statements, and for the first time he didn't look for a way to spin them. He just saw the debt. Debt is a silent rust. It doesn't make a sound while it's eating the heart out of your freedom. I forced him to perform a structural audit on his own life, comparing his debt-to-income ratio to a bridge's load capacity. You've been living at 110% capacity, I explained, tapping the paper. No bridge survives that, Julian. Not one. I made him take the pen and cross out every luxury until all that was left was the bare minimum for survival. One by one, the designer closed the memberships, and the travel vanished under thick black lines. All the Vance influence was being stripped away, leaving only the raw, unadorned structure of a life he could actually afford. What do I do now? He asked, looking at the meager list. I have nothing left on this page. You have the truth I said. That's a lot more than you had when you walked into this house tonight. He looked down at the pad, his shoulders slumped, finally standing on solid if bare ground. We sat there for a long time as the kitchen clock ticked away the remains of his old identity. The audit was complete, the body of his ambition laid open on the yellow legal pad. Julian reached for the pad to clear the table, but as he flipped the page over, he stopped. He stared at the back of the cardboard backing. There, in my precise architectural handwriting, was a series of notes dated 3 years ago. It was a prediction, a detailed breakdown of his trajectory, listing the exact date the Heights estate would likely go into, default based on his known debt load. I had missed the actual date by only 4 days. Julian's breath hitched as he read the autopsy of his life, written before the body was even cold. "You saw this coming 3 years ago," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I did," I said, meeting his gaze with a stoic, understated power. "I knew the load wouldn't hold. I just had to wait for you to realize that I wasn't the one trying to pull you down." Julian looked at the pad, then at his soil-stained hands, and I saw the first sign of a real reconstruction beginning in his mind. He wasn't just intellectually crushed, he was morally awakening. The inspection was finally over, and the demolition of his ego was total. Now we just had to see what was worth salvaging from the wreckage. I watched Julian hand the keys of his leased Mercedes to the intake manager, the silver fob looking like a heavy shackle he was finally brave enough to unlock. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sterile scent of new car leather and the faint hum of a dealership, awakening to a new day of selling dreams on credit. Julian stood by the service bay, his posture straighter than it had been in years, though his eyes were fixed on the polished asphalt. Sterling, a dealership manager, whose smile was as polished and predatory as the chrome on the showroom floor, looked at the returned lease with the practiced disappointment of a man about to charge a heavy fee. He performed a slow walk around of the vehicle, his iPad clicking, with every minor imperfection he cataloged. I stood back by my old sedan, watching the transaction with a quiet surgical focus. Sterling began to list the early termination fees, the over-mileage penalties, and the reconditioning costs, a tally that amounted to a small fortune. I forced Julian to listen to every word to confront the absolute loss of capital this performance had cost him. "It's just metal and leather, Julian," I said softly as the manager stepped away to process the paperwork. "It never loved you back." Julian nodded, a cathartic release washing over his features. "I feel lighter, Dad. For the first time in 3 years, I don't feel like I'm being chased by a monthly payment." The Mercedes engine didn't roar as it left. It whimpered. We left the glass palace of the dealership in my 2009 sedan, the engine turning over with a reliable, honest thrum. Our next stop was a used car lot on the edge of town, where the air smelled of grease and honest utility. I watched Julian walk among the rows of vehicles, no longer looking for something to project status, but for something structurally sound. He eventually settled on a high-mileage, reliable Japanese SUV. It was a utilitarian charcoal gray, much like my own car. He used the small amount of cash I had lent him against his future labor in my rental properties to finalize the purchase. Before we left the lot, I made him pop the hood. I took a drop of engine oil onto my fingertip, feeling the gritty texture and explaining how to check the fluids. "Why do we value the shine on the hood more than the strength of the axle?" I asked him. "Maintenance is the highest form of ownership, Julian. If you don't take care of the small things, the big things will eventually stop for you." He listened with an intensity I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. The heavy, satisfying thunk of the used SUV's door closing sounded more like freedom than the Mercedes ever had. "Vanessa actually likes the color," he told me through the window. "She said it looks like we're finally going somewhere real." He followed me back to the bungalow, his new-to-him vehicle keeping a steady pace in my rearview mirror. Julian reveals a detail of Garrett's desperation during the drive home, confessing during a brief stop for gas that Garrett had actually tried to convince him to accidentally total the Mercedes for the insurance money weeks ago. It was a crime Julian had refused to commit, the first sign that the Garrison steel was still somewhere inside him. By the time we reached my study, the sun was beginning to set, casting long orange shadows across the vintage bridge maps on my wall. It was time for the final revelation. I sat at my desk and pulled out my actual investment statements. Not the summaries from the dinner, but the full 35-year history. I laid them out on the oak table like a blueprint for a life. Julian sat across from me, his eyes widening as he traced the slow, agonizing start of the portfolio. He saw the years of meager contributions and the explosive power of the final decade. He stared at the dividends being reinvested during the 2008 market crash, a time when he remembered me being particularly frugal with our household budget. I wasn't being cheap, Julian. I was holding the line when everyone else was running for the exits. Thane's investment chart was a bridge that spanned 3 decades of storms, and every dividend was a rivet holding the whole thing together. "I called you a failure while you were building a mountain," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a profound respect. "I was standing in a hole and calling it a skyscraper. I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking. This wasn't luck, I told him. This was discipline. It's the same discipline you're starting to build now. I reached into a lower drawer and pulled out one more document, a title deed I had recently acquired. You thought you were done with Garrett Vance, but the math isn't finished yet. I showed Julian the distressed debt I had bought on Garrett's properties. It actually included the title to the very office building Garrett used to snub me from his balcony. I'm now his landlord in absentia, I explained. The man who tried to take your home just lost his own to the man he ignored. Julian stared at the deed, the irony of the situation settling over him like a heavy coat. He didn't laugh, he just nodded, understanding finally that power isn't about the view from the balcony, but about who owns the ground beneath it. We sat in the quiet study for a long time. The silence no longer a barrier between us, but a shared foundation. The bridge was finally finished, its load test passed with flying colors. Julian stared at the 35-year growth chart, his finger hovering over the 2008 crash where I had doubled my holdings, and he finally asked the question that meant our reconstruction was complete. Dad, can we host a BBQ for the family here next week? I looked at my son, seeing the man I had raised finally standing on his own feet. We can, I said. I think it's time we showed them what a real foundation looks like. A bridge is only as good as the traffic it can carry without groaning, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt the structure of my family holding firm as they stepped onto my porch. The heat of a South Carolina July hung heavy over Rock Hill, but in the shade of my brick bungalow, the air felt clean. I had spent the morning preparing the backyard, not with the frantic performative energy of the heights, but with the quiet precision of a man setting his own table. I chose a bag of honest charcoal over a gas grill, wanting the smoke to mean something. I set the patio table with paper plates and colorful plastic cups, a stark defiance of the sterile catering that had once defined my son's life. Vanessa arrived first, her car, no longer a gleaming status symbol, but a reliable tool. She stepped into the kitchen and immediately began helping with the sides, her movements fluid and unburdened. She looked lighter than I had ever seen her, the designer edges of her personality softened by a new sense of purpose. She told me she had officially closed her high-end firm to focus on sustainable community design, a shift she admitted was inspired by my philosophy of maintenance. It's not as fancy as the Heights, Vanessa, I said, handing her a bowl of potato salad. She smiled, and for the first time the expression reached her eyes. It's better, Thane. I don't feel like I have to check the price tag on the air I'm breathing here. Paper plates don't shatter. Neither does a man who has nothing left to prove. I watched Julian pull into the driveway in the used SUV we had vetted together. He wasn't just driving it, he was owning it. He stepped out and reached into the back seat for Leo Garrison, aged 7, who possessed his grandmother's inquisitive eyes and a way of tilting his head that suggested he was already looking for the logic in the world around him. Julian looked at me over the roof of the car and gave a quick, sharp nod, the silent language of men who finally understand the blueprints. I took Leo by the hand and led him to the small vegetable patch in the corner of the lot. The soil was dark and rich, a living portfolio I had been tending for decades. "Grandpa, why don't we just buy the tomatoes at the store?" Leo asked, his fingers hovering over a ripening vine. "Because the store doesn't teach you how to survive a drought." "Leo," I told him, kneeling down so we were eye to eye, "this garden is like a bank. If you protect the soil, that's your principal. The fruit will be your dividends. They'll feed you forever." He listened with a focus Julian never had at that age, his small hands already covered in the cool, wet texture of the earth. He was learning that things grow from the ground up, not from the top down. Why do we wait for the storm to hit before we check if the roof is bolted down? I moved back to the grill, the smell of hickory smoke and searing beef filling the yard. Julian was sitting on the bench watching Leo dig in the dirt, when a car I recognized idled at the curb. The man who pulled into the driveway wearing a suit too tight for the South Carolina heat and a smile that was purely for reconnaissance was the living embodiment of everything Julian used to be. It was one of Julian's former sales associates, a man who had undoubtedly heard rumors of Julian's financial collapse and had come to gloat under the guise of a social visit. I watched from the grill, my tongs poised, ready to step in. But I didn't need to. Julian stood up before the man could even reach the porch. He didn't look ashamed, and he didn't try to hide me in the shadows. "So, this is the modest life Julian the man?" asked, his eyes darting toward the 2009 sedan. "What happened to the Mercedes?" Julian didn't flinch. "I traded it for an anchor," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the other man's smirk. "This is my father, Thane. He didn't just build bridges. He built the man standing in front of you. He introduced me as the most successful man he knew, explaining the structural integrity of a life built on rock instead of sand. I stayed by the grill, feeling a fierce, silent pride. My son had finally stopped chasing shadows. The sizzle of the burgers on the grill was a more honest sound than any toast Garrett Vance ever offered to the wind. The associate didn't stay long. There is no fuel for a predator in a house that refuses to be shamed. As the sun began to dip, casting long golden shadows across the lawn, Julian revealed a detail that caught me off guard. He mentioned almost casually that he had been spending his weekends volunteering at a bridge restoration nonprofit. He was using his sales skills to raise money for the very structures I had spent my life inspecting. He was finding value in the old bones of the county, just as he was finding it in our own family. We sat at the table, the paper plates laden with food, and for the first time in 3 years, the conversation wasn't a performance. It was a maintenance log of a life well lived. Vanessa leaned in close to me as we were clearing the table, her eyes wet with a joy that had nothing to do with bank statements. She whispered the news into my ear she was pregnant again. They had already decided that if it was a boy, his middle name would be Marshall. It was my secret middle name, a name I had only ever shared with Ellen. I looked at my family, the traffic of their lives finally moving across a bridge that wouldn't groan under the weight of the truth. I realized I had one last structure to build before I was truly finished. I needed to ensure this ground was theirs forever. The granite was cold under my hand, a silent witness to the 15 years I'd spent building a fortress out of grief and index funds. The morning mist clung to the low ground of Oakwood Cemetery, wrapping the headstones in a soft gray shroud that felt more like a blanket than a veil. I stood before Ellen's grave, the dampness of the grass seeping through the soles of my shoes. But for the first time in a decade, the chill didn't reach my bones. Julian stood beside me, his head bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, with a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with tailored wool or social standing. I took a slow breath, the air tasting of damp earth and morning dew. I'm here to deliver the final inspection report. Ellen, I said, my voice steady and low. The structure is sound. The boy is finally standing on rock, not sand. Julian looked at the headstone, his eyes wet but clear. I'm sorry it took me a collapse to finally see you, Dad. And her. I spent so long mocking the boring life you lived, not realizing it was the only thing keeping the roof over our heads. I saw him reach out and touch the carved letters of his mother's name, finally acknowledging the depth of her sacrifice and the quiet, heavy burden I had carried to ensure his world never truly shattered. I didn't tell him right then that the peace he felt was reinforced by a secret I had guarded for 30 years. Why do we spend our lives trying to outrun the silence of a cemetery, only to realize it's the only place where the truth finally stops moving? As we walked back to the used SUV, I revealed the entry twist of his new reality. The trust I set up for you wasn't just savings, Julian. It was funded by a dead man's Switch account I'd established the day you were born. It was programmed to remain invisible, a ghost in the ledger, until the day you admitted the truth about the $82,000. It only became active once you found the courage to stop lying to yourself. He stopped at the car door, the realization hitting him with the weight of a falling beam. You had that ready the whole time, even when I was insulting you? Especially then, I replied. A bridge inspector doesn't abandon the site just because the owner is a fool. He just waits for the owner to realize the bridge is swaying. We drove back to the brick bungalow. In a comfortable silence, the orange light of the rising sun glinting off the cemetery gates in the rearview mirror. Once inside my study, I cleared the vintage maps off the oak table and laid out the blueprint for the Legacy Trust. This was the structure I had spent the last 6 months perfecting, the last bridge I would ever design. It wasn't just a pile of money, Julian. It was a constitution. The trust wasn't a gift. It was a constitution. I walked him through the itemized breakdown: governed funds for Leo's education, restricted access for the new baby, and character-based milestones that require professional integrity and debt management. This isn't a windfall, Julian, I explained, pointing to the governed clauses. It's an endowment for the Garrison name. It's built to survive people like Garrett Vance. It ensures that the ground beneath your children's feet is never again used as secondary collateral. Julian traced the legal language with his finger, his face reflecting a mix of awe and a new heavy sense of responsibility. You've planned for everything, he whispered, even the things I didn't think mattered. I sat back, the bitter, earthy taste of black coffee finally warming my throat. There was one final rivet to drive home. I slid the thick stack of parchment across the table, the same table where he had once begged for $82,000 with rain dripping off his hair. I need you to sign this, Julian. I'm appointing you as the co-trustee. He looked at the pen as if it were a 60-ton girder. Me? After everything I did, I'm not giving you this money, Julian. I'm giving you the responsibility of guarding it. I'm trusting you to be the inspector now. I'm trusting you to look for the rust before it eats the heart out of our family again. As Julian reached for the heavy fountain pen, I felt a profound sense of closure. The scratch of the pen on the thick paper was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, satisfying noise that sounded to me like the final rivet being driven into a structure that would now stand for generations. I won't let the rust back in, Dad, he said, his hand steadier than I had ever seen it. I promise. Signing that paper was the final stress test. The ink was the seal that proved the Garrison Bridge could finally hold the weight of the future. I watched him sign his name next to mine, the Garrison name, finally standing alone without the hyphenated shadow of the Vance legacy. I felt the understated power of the moment, the strategic security of my family, finally matching the structural integrity of my portfolio. We sat in the study for a long time afterward, the morning light filling the room and illuminating the dust motes dancing over the vintage bridge maps. The demolition was over. The reconstruction was legally certified. Julian handed me back the pen, his expression serene and rooted. I looked at the signature, then at the calendar on my desk. There was only one date left, circled in red. It was the end of the year, the anniversary of the night the first crack appeared in the Heights. I realized there was one final date on the calendar. We still had to face one last gathering to prove that the new foundation wasn't just a legal document, but a way of life. Happy New Year is coming, Julian, I said, looking toward the window. Let's make sure this time the cake is worth eating. He laughed a real unburdened sound, and I knew that while my work as an inspector was finished, my life as a father was finally beginning. The calendar was down to its final page, but as I watched my son help his pregnant wife up the porch steps, I realized the most important structure I'd ever built was finally ready to face the new year. The evening was crisp, a sharp South Carolina winter that tasted of pine needles and the promise of frost. I stood by the door of the brick bungalow, the warm golden glow of the windows spilling out onto the driveway. Julian handed me a small box as he entered, and for a second I looked at his hand, not the steadiness of it which I'd already certified, but the name on the return address label he'd brought over for a package. He told me with a quiet sort of pride that he had officially filed the paperwork to drop the Vance hyphenate. He was just Julian Garrison again, shedding the weight Garrett had insisted on for social standing, like a rusted pylon being cut from a bridge deck. I realized then that the final date on the calendar wasn't an ending, but the first day the load would be carried by the right names. We gathered in the dining room for a dinner that cost less than the appetizers at the Heights, yet felt infinitely more substantial. The smell of homemade apple pie began to drift from the oven, filling the house with a sweetness that didn't feel manufactured. There were no grand toasts to yachts or visionary empires tonight. The conversation centered on Leo's school projects and the upcoming baby. Vanessa sat next to Julian, her presence grounding the room. They presented me with a gift, a simple wooden frame containing a photo of the three of us working in the garden, our hands covered in the honest dirt of the lot. "We didn't need a caterer, Dad," Julian said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "We just needed to be here." Vanessa nodded, her eyes soft in the candlelight. "It's the first time in years I don't feel like I'm acting in a play," she added. The champagne was cheap. The company was priceless. I sat back in my chair listening to the honest, structural warmth of their laughter, and I knew the silence I had once used as a bunker was finally being replaced by a home. Why do we spend our lives building towers when the only thing that matters is the strength of the basement? As the clock ticked toward 11, the house grew quiet. The frantic energy of the old years replaced by a steady rhythmic peace. Leo crawled into my lap as the countdown on the television began to flicker in the corner of the room. "Grandpa, do you miss the big house?" he asked, his voice small and curious. "Do you miss the mansion Garrett used to have?" I took him to the living room window and pointed out at the dark, sturdy trees in the backyard, their branches silhouetted against the starlight. "Leo, a bird doesn't need a golden cage to fly. It just needs a branch that won't break," I told him. "A mansion is just a shell, but a home is an anchor." I explained to him that rich is having enough to be quiet, while poor is having so much you have to scream just to make sure you're still there. He tilted his head, processing the logic with that inquisitive gaze he had inherited from Ellen, and I knew the foundation I was laying for him would hold long after I was gone. After the family retired to the guest rooms, the house settled into the deep, comfortable silence of a structure that owes no one an explanation. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold bite of the winter air hitting my face and clearing the last of the evening's warmth from my lungs. I looked at my 2009 sedan, still parked in its usual spot, its charcoal paint muted in the moonlight. I realized that every mile on that odometer was a step toward this moment of peace. I reflected on the structural integrity of truth, how it can be buried under layers of debt and ego. But it never rots. It just waits for the weight to become too much for the lies to carry. I watched the first light of 2025 begin to peek over the horizon, a thin line of gray and violet. The old year left like a tired pylon being removed. The new one arrived like a freshly set beam, cold clean and ready for the load. I build things to last, Ellen, I whispered into the dark. And this one is going to hold. Happy New Year to a man who finally owns himself. I walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, the gravel crunching under my feet, with a sound that was mine and mine alone. Inside, tucked behind a few late cards, was a small final note from Pamela. I brought it back to the porch light and felt the papery texture of the stationery. She told me she had finally divorced Garrett and was using her half of the remaining hidden assets to start a foundation for victims of financial fraud. She thanked me again for the wrecking ball. I breathed in the cold, sharp air of a year I didn't have to pay anyone for. And as I looked at the note from Pamela, I realized that while the Garrison Bridge was safe, I might have just found a reason to build one more. I turned back toward the house, the golden light of the windows welcoming me. My work as an inspector was truly finished. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to look for cracks. I just needed to walk through the door. I've learned from this family story it's that silence doesn't preserve love. It slowly reshapes it into distance. And distance, if left unchecked, becomes something far colder. That's how family betrayal begins, not in one moment, but in all the moments we choose not to speak. I built security, but I failed to teach respect. I gave stability, but I hid the cost behind it. And in doing so, I allowed my own son to mistake quiet strength for weakness. This family story isn't about money. It's about what happens when values are inherited without understanding. Don't make my mistake. Don't assume the people you love see what you've sacrificed. Show them, tell them, stand firm before the cracks begin. I still believe in forgiveness, but not without boundaries. Even God teaches us that love without truth is incomplete. And sometimes the hardest thing a father must do is step back and let the lesson land. Because in the end, every family story is a test of what we choose to protect our pride or our principles. And every family betrayal leaves behind a question. Will you rebuild stronger or pretend nothing broke? Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in a situation like this difficult choice between loyalty and self-respect? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Just a small note. While inspired by themes like generational conflict and trust within families, some elements have been adapted for storytelling. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore others that better match your interests.